I'm Andy Smith on behalf of the Food Studies Department of the New School. I'm absolutely delighted to present Tyler Colman. Tyler actually is a doctor. I know that sounds strange, from Northwestern University. Unlike so many other people on the web who are doctors, he doesn't just play one on the web, he actually is one. Got it in political science and on political economy, and the book that we have over here for sale, which you all want to buy, I'm sure, is based on his dissertation. So congratulations on that. That's a wonderful thing. He's also published a second book, and we haven't even talked about this, but it's A Year of Wine, Perfecting Pairings, Great Buys, and What to Sip with Each Season. I hope you're not going to suggest rosé, and now that it's summertime, but we'll look forward to some recommendations. He does have a website and a blog, and the blog you actually do every single day. Unlike other bloggers that I know that maybe on occasion, you actually do have people commenting on your blog as well. I think that's an amazing thing. It's drvino.com. So just in case you want to examine some of the things there, I was going to say Dr. Wino, but I didn't think that would. That's right. I didn't think that would be pronounced right. By the way, I just want you to know, on his website, he claims he tastes 1,000 wines a year. Now, in talking with him, he said, no, that number is really low. It's more like 3,000 wines. So if you have questions about wines, even on things that he doesn't cover, I'm sure he would be more than willing to offer his opinion on things. And I found, at least based on what I've read, what's amazing is he takes no money from anyone in the wine industry. This is another unusual thing about people who write. There's ethics. Does this name ring a bell with anybody? Ethics, something like that? And so his views are his views, and I'm absolutely delighted with that. So Tyler?
All right, Andy. Thank you very much. Thanks, Andy, and it's great to be here, and I'm really pleased you all could all make it tonight on this sticky afternoon, early evening here. But there's nothing better to talk about than wine. Of course, it'd be great to taste some wine, but we weren't able to swing that logistically here today. But we'll talk about it nonetheless. And what we're going to talk about today is sort of the basis of my book. And I'm going to just touch on a few of the points here in this talk, and I'm happy to go into more detail during a question and answer period. But basically what we're going to talk about today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the backstory of the wine industry in France and the United States. And then I'm also going to touch a little bit on the role of critics and how they influence the wines we drink. So yeah, what is wine politics? We need to sort of have a definitional question at the outset of our discussion here tonight. Does it involve politicians? Here's a scene from Buckingham Palace a couple of weeks ago where our president was toasting the Queen. So is that what we're going to talk about? Are queens and presidents involved in our narrative? Well, not too much, not too much. Just a little bit more micro than that. But I do have a series on my blog called Leaders and Leaders. So that's leaders and then LITERS. So we can keep track of what leaders are actually drinking when they toast and things like that. So we can actually keep a close eye on the White House wine steward and what sort of travesties he's trying to foist on international dignitaries when in Washington. So why don't we limber up with a couple of questions to sort of get used to our topic today. First question. So this ad here shows two pictures, and this one on the left was deemed too sultry for which country, France or the United States? And it was replaced by this one, which was less sultry, deemed less sultry. So which country? France? How many people say France? No. People, how about puritanical America? Was that deemed too sultry? Yes. Well, in fact, it was France. This is a French grower, and they proposed this ad in the first on the left, and it was too hot for the French to handle, apparently. So it was rejected. So. All right, well, let's limber up with another question. Is it easier to ship a case of wine from Napa to Nashville or from Bordeaux to Berlin? Bordeaux to Berlin, in fact, is correct. You are not going to be so easily fooled this time, huh? So it's true. We have a lot of interstate restrictions on shipping wine, which makes it a real headache for people who live in a lot of states, unfortunately. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But by contrast, in Europe, it's actually relatively frictionless to get the goods from winery to your table. So yeah. What's happening in France? Well, they have a lot of appellations, and there's been a steady growth in appellations. Appellations were first put into place as a framework for protecting the quality of winemaking, so that a wine that comes from a specifically geographically designated area then would be protected. And so it was sort of a proxy for quality at the outset. Unfortunately, now there's been such a proliferation of appellations, or AOCs as they're sometimes called, appellations d'origine contrôlée, and so that now it's no longer really a proxy for quality, unfortunately. In fact, now it's kind of stifling quality in a lot of cases, which is a problem, and because the restrictions are becoming more narrow. In terms of particularly like grape varieties, and so, for example, in the Loire, there are a lot of heirloom or older grape varieties that are no longer authorized. So the list of authorized varieties shrinks, and so in order to make a wine from an heirloom grape variety, for example, a grower would have to go outside the appellation system, which may sound like not such a big deal in America, but in fact in France they're quite hidebound there and really respect the appellation tradition. And so you see, you've only seen a handful of producers really try to make their wines outside of the appellation system, but you're starting to see an increasing number as they chafe at the regulations in the appellation system. So, so yeah, one of the so there, I detail a few of the criteria that the appellation control there. And so, yeah, but there is a crisis going on in France right now when it comes to wine. It's really sort of a Dickensian time in France because it's the best of times and the worst of times for the French wine industry. At the high end, wines are fetching higher and higher prices. And at the low end, there are, sadly, growers going bankrupt in the rate of, say, 500 last year in Bordeaux, 80 in the past year in the Muscadet region, and so on and so on. And so it's really a tough time, really a bifurcated market that you're seeing right now, and a tough time at the low end. And part of what explains the decline is the decline in consumption in France. And so the domestic market is obviously the biggest market for French wine. And what's led to that decline in consumption is, well, people just not having wine at lunch anymore. Younger people actually reaching for other drinks other than wine, and so they're actually drinking more spirits and also beer as well as soft drinks as opposed to wine. So although the French per capita consumption rate towers above ours at about 55, 53 liters per person per year, whereas ours is about 14 per capita. Again, it is declining, and sort of so it's not a growth market anymore, unfortunately. So, but other factors have contributed to the decline, such as advertising regulations. It's actually quite hard to market wines now in France, which is surprising, and that was what I touched on with the first slide. There are quite a few regulations there. Also, anti-drunken driving campaigns, and so that was what this graphic, this picture is here, is actually here nestled next to the Love condoms on the pharmacy shelf is actually a breathalyzer test that you can take, and so so there you go. That's how popular they are. You can get them right next to the condoms. So yeah, but other factors are also at play. Exports are softening thanks to the strong euro, and there is just a lot of surplus wine. So here's just a graphic. Don't want to intimidate you with a chart there, but just shows the growth in appellation acreage and production volumes. So yeah, unfortunately, the growth has led to this, which is actually appellation wines being distilled into ethanol for the first time in 2005, actually. So And so, yes, so can cars run on Cabernet is the key question then you confront in France. And in fact, yes, as I say, while table wine, sort of the lowest of the administrative categories in France, has been distilled into alcohol for quite a while. This was the first time in 2005 that Appellation wine had been distilled into ethanol. So yes, but at the other end of the spectrum, though, are the soaring prices for first growth Bordeaux and other high-end wines from France. And so most notable is, well, there are two notable cases, really, Petrus and Lafite, Chateau Lafite, that you may have heard of some of these wines. But it's really being driven by, at first, the 2005 vintage got a lot of praise from several key critics, and that caused a lot of demand in America. That was back when our economy was firing on all cylinders, and so, but now a lot of that demand that we see, because the 2009 vintage has also received quite a bit of praise, and so, but that demand is mostly coming from the Far East now, particularly China, Hong Kong. So, but yeah, so one way to illustrate this, I put up two different cars there for you. The top is a Jetta, because that actually indicates the price on release of the 2005 Petrus, a case. So it's about $24,000 for a case of Petrus on release. And had you bought it then, thinking it was complete folly, in fact, it would be worth now a BMW 528i, or about $50,000. So carrying on with our cars theme, the same slide, I thought I'd put those on there for you. And that actually is about the release price of the 2009 as well, about $4,000 a bottle. So pretty amazing prices that they're getting. So yeah. Turning back in time a little bit into our other case country, the United States, it's taking. We just thought I'd briefly summarize some of the political intrigue in the story of wine in America, and it starts way back in the colonial period with King James. Look at him; he looks like such a jolly Englishman, doesn't he? And he actually had harbored desires to turn America into a wine-producing colony so he could reduce trade with dreaded rivals France and Spain. But alas, his plans did not work out, and he and the colonists, the grapes did not grow very successfully, and despite his best efforts, and what did grow successfully was, of course, tobacco, which he abhorred. So his plans failed miserably. The next notable leader in our story of wine in America was Thomas Jefferson, who thought not only acquired a taste for the fruits of the vine while he was America's representative in France, but he also saw the winemaking as sort of fitting in well with his idea of an agrarian republic. And he himself, of course, retired to Monticello and planted vines, which fared not very well, unfortunately, for him. But yes, he also thought it was a drink of moderation. And in his day, the drink of choice, what was the drink of choice back in his day? Whiskey, of course. Exactly, the ardent spirits that plagued his administration. So he tried to, in his time, his day, he saw wine as a drink of moderation, and as he said that no nation is drunken where wine is cheap. So obviously he hasn't been to the south of France. Didn't spend that much time in the south of France. But anyway, he did see it as a drink of moderation, which is sort of a European perspective, seeing it more as an element of dinner table and mealtime. So yeah. Anyway, just in a nutshell, to explain what was the problem for King James and Thomas Jefferson, it's actually the root of the problem is, in fact, a small aphid that ate the roots of the vines, and it's known as phylloxera, which some of you may have heard of. But so when King James and the colonists arrived in North America, they saw grapes growing abundantly, but they were actually the Vitis labrusca species, whereas the wine grapes of Europe is the Vitis vinifera species. So importing Vitis vinifera to the United States or to North America did not, in fact, work as the aphid actually ate the roots of the vine, and so for hundreds of years it was a real problem, and there was no real answer to why the Vitis vinifera was doing so poorly in North America, and while the Vitis labrusca actually proliferated. So, and they tried making wine from Vitis labrusca, and it was horrible, and King James each barrel that would send over to him was worse than the one before it, because they started boiling it and doing who knows what else to it to try to make it palatable. So anyway, it ended up being a bit of a international disaster, as Vitis labrusca was in fact inadvertently transported to France, bringing with it the phylloxera laus in the mid to late 19th century, and so it caused a problem, and led to the devastation of huge amounts of vineyard area. At first, just in the south of France, but later in as far as Turkey. It was found as far as Turkey and the Iberian Peninsula, and so it really spread tremendously far. So ultimately, there was a solution, and the solution was to use the rootstock from the Vitis labrusca, which was resistant to the phylloxera laus, and to graft onto that the Vitis vinifera. So, and that happens to this day. It's very, very rare grapevine indeed that's on its own roots now. So, so yes, we have a international collaboration, if you will, for this problem. So yeah, but once the Transcontinental Railroad really opened up California, and there was no phylloxera laus in California. It had not traversed the Rockies, so they were able to plant Vitis vinifera, and it actually grew successfully in California. So so yeah, and a lot of the people who came for the gold rush actually brought vines with them and started planting, and so that's how California really took off initially as the sort of breadbasket of wine in America, if you will. But just as we overcame the natural problems with wine, making wine and quality wine in America, we had societal problems with wine, and that was that wine had alcohol in it, and so it was actually part of the ensnared in the legislation that framed Prohibition. So from 1919 to 1933, of course, there was no alcohol allowed to be produced, consumed, distributed in the United States. So it was, and wine got caught up in that too, of course, even though it was not at all the target of the legislation. In fact, it got caught up in a kind of bad way because there was a fruit exemption, and so there was originally this loophole was driven by cider producers from Virginia, of all places, and so, but it allowed each household to make 200 gallons of non-intoxicating fruit juice, and so, so there was a lot of non-intoxicating juice being made in sheds and bathtubs and who knows where else, and so unfortunately, and there were actually kits that were available for sale through catalogs. You're not allowed to make wine, but you're allowed to make non-intoxicating fruit juice from this dehydrated grape, and so they even had instructions on how not to make wine with it. And so it actually, wine came to, unfortunately, get a bit of that reputation that Thomas Jefferson had really sought to have it shed. He saw it as an alternative drink of moderation, but unfortunately, during Prohibition, it came to be seen as a way to a highway to a cheap buzz, really. So, and so, yeah, with the repeal of Prohibition, there was a lot of knowledge in winemaking and also vineyard stock that needed to be replanted, and so the wine industry had really took a blow during Prohibition, even though, and also because of this change in perception of wine too and what it was. So, but yeah, with the repeal of Prohibition, the dries, as they were known, that had wielded enough power to pass the legislation of Prohibition, actually were weakened at that point, and so but they still retained enough power at the federal level so that the only type of repeal would be to push it back to the states to make the decision. And so as a result, we don't have a uniform standard for alcohol policy in the United States. It's a state level policy, which means that there's a patchwork of 50 different regulations today. And fortunately for us here in New York allows, I mean, not only is it a wine-producing state, but it's also a state that has good liberal shipping laws. So we are able to get lots of wine from lots of different places here. Unfortunately, that is somewhat in question now because of a new bill that's been introduced to Albany, that would limit the amount of wines that could be brought into New York State, because there is a legal but side channel called the gray market that gets a lot of fine and rare wines, but this bill in Albany that may or may not go anywhere, hopefully it doesn't, but it has been introduced nonetheless, but it would prohibit this gray market. It would outlaw the gray market. So it would make everything slow way down, get more expensive, and ultimately basically turn New York restaurant scene to have a wine list similar to Applebee's, probably. So there you go. But yeah, so it's a difficult problem that wine lovers certainly confront in a lot of states. Has anyone been to a wine store in Pennsylvania, for example? And what struck you about that wine store? Oh, you were too young. Oh, so everything struck you. I thought it was great. Anybody else been there since they were 21? Yeah? They're run by the state, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So. Exactly. She says it rarely includes anything you want to buy, so everyone goes to New Jersey or somewhere else. So there you go. But yeah, so it's not exactly what you'd expect to find in the land of the free, you know. But nonetheless, that's what you find when in American wine regulations. So yeah, but even though that is sort of a sad note, especially for those residing in Pennsylvania, there is a happy story, though, here in wine in America, and that's the fact that we really are getting into wine after our late start. We're kind of making up for lost time now, and we've seen 17 consecutive years in a rise in our per capita consumption. So even though, as I said earlier, we're still a relative weakling in the international tables, we're doing our best, and it's a growth market. And it's now, because of the size of our population, we've actually risen to become the largest wine-consuming country in the world now. And so, yeah, it's a very positive story. It spurred a lot of growth in wineries, and you can now find a bonded winery in all 50 states. So yeah, there is. It's very, very exciting story, wine in America. Lots of great wines out there. But what could end the three-tier system? Well, ultimately, political finance reform would go a long way, and there is legislation right now in the U.S. House that called H.R. 1161 is what it's the bill number. But anyway, it would make it again difficult to challenge legally state. Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry. The three-tier system, it means that it has that wine has to go through a distributor. And so if you think of the tiers, it's a producer or a winery, and then a distributor, a middleman who would buy the wine. And in each state is going to have a different distributor, and then it goes to a retail shop or a restaurant. So those are the three tiers, and then ultimately, to us, the consumers. So, but yeah, there are those three tiers, and so it's legally mandated to have to use a distributor for out-of-state wines. In-state wines in most states can actually self-distribute. So in California, some wineries do that, and in New York, some wineries do that too. But the thing is, and in some states though, the use of the distributor actually, like Ohio has a minimum markup of 33%. So it doesn't lead to a lot of competition sometimes, especially in smaller markets. In some smaller states, there might only be 3 or 4 distributors, for example, in the whole state. And so it's a difficult system because if you're a small producer, whether it's a domestic producer or of an imported wine, it can be hard to crack into a lot of the markets. So it does make it a little bit more difficult. And so, but on the other hand, for distributors, it's quite profitable, the system. And so they are able to have sort of a protected market in some states. Some states it's actually hard to fire your distributor if you're a winery. One winery owner from California told me that he was very unhappy with his distributor in Georgia, where it's very difficult to fire a distributor, and so he had to withdraw from the Georgia market for 5 years. Ultimately, and then when he sought to come back after 5 years of being out of Georgia, then he only got into a further dispute with his distributor because the distributor withheld, say, 10 cases of his wine and claimed to still be representing him and that he'd never left the market and that sort of thing, just to make his life difficult. So anyway, but yeah, for some of the higher volume wines, it's really quite lucrative who can have that, and so a lot of the distributors fight. Some of the larger distributors fight tooth and nail to protect this system that they have, which is to the detriment of consumers a lot of times. So, like this gray market example of this legislation, this bill, it's introduced in Albany. The market's functioning very well in New York City. New York State market is a thriving market. Arguably, I would say the best, most exciting wine market in the world, actually, New York City's. And so having a bill like this that would restrict the channels and force the wines back to go through distributors and then get approval in Albany and things like that would just really slow things down and not make it very interesting for a lot of people economically, so then we as consumers would have fewer wines available and less interesting wines. So, but yeah, so yeah, currently there is legislation at the U.S. House that would, in fact, prevent challenges, legal challenges to state laws. So that would be pretty damaging because then when something was in place, then it couldn't obviously be changed. So yeah, what could actually change that? Well, maybe a consumer Cabernet uprising where wine lovers take to the streets and flood the streets with Cabernet. But unfortunately, we don't have a long history of protests, unlike France, which there are protests quite regularly, strikes and things. But yes, not. I don't see that really happening too quickly. So another possibility would be a big retailer coming in to try and shake things up and to really push for it. And briefly, we saw that possibility with Amazon. Amazon was thinking about getting into the wine space and actually dedicated quite a bit of resources and about 3 years of their business plan to it. But ultimately, the challenges were insurmountable, and they withdrew before they even started, which was a real pity. So, because I think they could have really done something to reform wine, the way wine is bought and sold in the United States. So yeah, so it's a difficult situation, the political situation. But moving to our third topic, critics. I just thought I'd touch on the role of critics. Here, just in case you can't see it, I've got a 3-panel cartoon comic here. And as consumer comes in and says, geez, this wine is repulsive. And the clerk says, well, the wine advisor gave it a 96. And so the consumer says, okay, I'll take a case then. So unfortunately, even though we're able to select restaurants and which movies to go see and which artists we like with panache and brio, unfortunately we turn into quivering blobs when we're in the wine store all too often. And the main, for a couple of decades, we have relied quite heavily on certain critics. The power of critics was perhaps most pointedly the argument about the hyperpower, the extreme power of critics was laid out in this documentary Mondovino a few years ago. And his argument, the director's argument, was that the power of global critics has led to a convergence in production styles. And so, oops, sorry, we got a little picture over the text there. But yeah, that he he suggested that that critics lavished high scores on wines, then those wines then were made by certain consulting winemakers who then grew very popular, and their services were sought all around the world to fashion wines that would get then high scores, because then it's really easy to sell the wines ultimately. And so that's been a sales model in the wine industry for a good couple of decades now. And ultimately, scores have been kind of turned on their head as some consulting winemakers or facilities, or even like Enologics, which is based in California, will actually promise a certain score to a wine. And so they'll promise within a range, narrow range, that they'll fashion your wine to get a certain score from a certain critic. And so seems a little bit backwards to me. You think that they'd want to make the wine that would be most suited to their vineyard, or that consumers might like, or something. And so, but instead they're making it just to please a certain number of palates. Fortunately, that period is really drawing to a close now, as younger drinkers, younger cohorts from Gen X and from the so-called millennial generation, which is after the Gen X, are saying Bob who in regards to Robert Parker, who has wielded a tremendous amount of power and still does, and certainly has brought a lot of wine lovers, tens of thousands of wine lovers, in touch and connected them with wines that they've enjoyed. But now younger drinkers in particular are getting their wine recommendations from friends, from other sources, from friends and from store clerks, from online communities, and sommeliers in restaurants and so on. And so I think that the sun is sort of setting on the all-powerful critic model, and it's the way we talk about wine. I think it's symptomatic of our growing confidence with wine as a country, is that we're talking more about wine and having more of a discussion about wine. So instead of having these points handed down like manna from heaven, now we're actually trying wines and talking about them and deciding what it is that we like and don't like. And that's happening around dining room tables, and that's happening online, and it's happening in wine shops. And so it's a really great discussion. I think it's much more lateral, rather than this sort of top-down model that we had been living with here for quite a while. So yeah, and as a result of that, you're starting to see more producers who are, what I think is really one of the more exciting developments in the wine world, is you're starting to see more producers who are willing to work outside of the dominant frameworks, whether that's the appellation system that's shown to be broken, or this critic sales model that's also showed its limitations. And so here's one guy, Thierry Puzelat in the Loire, who is one of my heroes. He and his brother have a nonprofit to rescue these heirloom grape varieties in the Loire, and so they have all kinds of wonderful grape varieties that are kind of falling through the cracks. And he's also a mover and a shaker in the natural wine scene, which is becoming very popular, both in France and here in the United States as well. So yeah, it's a really promising direction, thinking about making wines that express the place they came from, and having and one from people that are not seeking necessarily to please one palate, but to express the wines and tradition from their regions. So yeah. All right. Well, I'm happy to take any questions and talk about anything you might have.
We are being taped, and we're more than willing to respond to any question, but I have to repeat the question in order to make sure it's on the tape. So you have a question? Yes. Can we lobby on behalf of the bill that you mentioned in Albany?
Well, against it, yeah.
Or against it, lobby on it, yes.
Right, yeah. Well, definitely, yep. If it's in Albany, so it would be you'd have to contact your assemblyman. And so I'm trying to think, if there's a website where you can do that. But anyway, you could probably just find out your district. But the representative's name, I'm trying to think, I could find out for you.
That would be good.
Yeah.
So we can take action.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, I don't have the number off on the tip of my tongue right here, but it's.
Tyler does have cards that he happened to bring with him, and so if you wish to communicate directly, I presume that that's the purpose of the cards.
Yeah,
if you wish to
yeah.
communicate directly with him, you
Absolutely,
can.
yeah.
Those of you who we
But,
have your email address, I will be delighted to forward that information
I believe
out.
the bill's author's name is Robin Schiminger something. I'm not quite sure how to spell that. So. But yes, one of the top donors to his campaigns traditionally has been beer and spirits wholesalers, beer, wine, spirits wholesalers. So yeah, yeah.
Can you talk more about the organic wine trade, and if I may add something in, the biodynamic wine as well?
Okay, yeah, sure, yeah. That's organic wine also sort of ties in with where I was going there at the end with natural wines, because wines. Natural wines encompass organic wines and biodynamic wines, sort of a catch-all term. But it's organic wine is a little bit tricky because of labeling laws in the United States. The United States labeling laws do not allow adding sulfur to call a wine organic. So what you end up seeing is that there are only about 5 wines in the U.S. market that would qualify for that, and so. So what you see a lot more is made with organically grown grapes, and so, but that's a weaker standard for labeling because they only need to have 75% of the grapes to actually be organically grown to say that on the label. So it's a little problem with truthiness that we have in the American wine labeling scene. Hardly anything has to be 100% true that you see on the label. So. Few exceptions. So.
Another question? What's the difference between organic and biodynamic?
Yep. Well, organic basically tells you what you can't do, and you can't have use synthetic fertilizers or pesticides, for example, in the vineyard. Biodynamic, on the other hand, accepts organic prohibitions, prescriptions, but then it also adds in further elements of winemaking and grape growing, and those include trying to align the vineyard and cellar activities with the celestial calendar, with the lunar cycle, and so it's really taking things back to a pre-industrial era of farming and winemaking and things, and so then there is a little bit of controversial point because it is, but it's sort of like I think of it as sort of like feng shui for the vineyard because you're really just trying to put things in the right place at the right time, and so it's I don't think people are out there really hating feng shui, and so it's sort of the same thing. But yeah.
Another question. The question's on homogenization of wine, and particularly Robert Parker, and with the extent that he did it, and also to the extent that the large wine producers like Constellation, in fact, are also doing that, and my added to that, the consolidation of the wine industry.
Yeah, well, the wine industry on the producer side is not consolidating. Actually, the distributors are really consolidating, but the wineries are proliferating and consumers are growing. So it's kind of like an hourglass in a way. So it's the distributor tier that's consolidating into fewer and fewer. So yeah, but there are nonetheless quite a few big producers of wine here in the United States. In the top 20, although there are 6,000 wineries in the United States, the top 20 wine producers make approximately 90% of the wine in America. And I think this is what you're talking about. And yeah, I think that the quality of what you refer to as supermarket wine, yeah, is generally going up. I mean, from what you saw, say, 3 decades ago, there's a lot more variety out there, and yeah, I think that it's headed in the right direction. Definitely, I think there are a lot of exciting offerings for people at the so-called supermarket level. Although we don't have supermarket wine here in New York. But where do you get supermarket wine if you can't get it at a supermarket? Anyway, but there you go, yeah. But yeah, no, it's I mean, they're really, again, 2 sort of sides of the wine market. One is going to be a higher volume side that you might get a store, like a supermarket, and then there's going to be sort of the specialty high-end wine market where you'd get it at a specialty shop.
The comment is on supermarket wines and not any attempt to appeal to the higher tastes.
Right, right. Yeah, well, supermarket wines, I mean, the branded wines, maybe we should call them, that because they really do rely on the brand, like Yellowtail, for example, is a notable example that it was just launched in 2001, and it was launched at an already pretty high production volume of 250,000 cases, but within a decade, it had grown to 10 million cases. So the popularity of that wine just really took off. And of course, they couldn't source that. It's not a single vineyard wine. In fact, if you look at the geographic designation on the wine, it just says Southeastern Australia, which, if you know anything about Australasia, it's quite a large territory. So yeah, it's not expressive of a certain place. It's expressive. It may be expressive of a grape or a certain rendition of that grape. I mean, while it doesn't appeal to me because I tend to prefer wines that are more expressive of place, you can't argue with the success, and it's brought a lot of people into wine. You know, I mean, if they're having Yellowtail at their tailgate party, you know, instead of beer, then hey, that's great. They're having wine, you know. So,
question here. What will be the influence of the social media? Is that the question?
Coming from your social graph.
So, from social graph on growth in the industry.
Well, yeah, no, I think that social media is a very exciting chapter of wine in America right now. And as I say, I think it's that we're more self-confident, we're more able to talk about wines from different places, different grape varieties, and so yeah, I think that gives a lot more opportunity for smaller winemakers to have greater renown in the United States market, because the market with just relying on a handful, maybe one handful of critics to really serve as gatekeepers, is very restrictive. But there's so many great wines out there from so many different places now that with social media and the rise of more people with greater authority in terms of recommending wines and things, then you're able to have more wines and more diversity, and I think that's a great thing. So. Yeah, I mean, I think that it can be a little bit disorderly. I mean, it's certainly hard to follow everything because of you don't know where the discussion's happening, whether it's on somebody's blog or on somebody's Facebook page or on Twitter, where it's very fast moving, but it's also kind of ephemeral. It's hard to keep a discussion going on Twitter, I find. And so, but it's great for a quick quip or a fast back and forth or something like that. But it's But yeah, no, it's terrific. I think it's a great new chapter of wine in America. It's really an important contribution. Yeah.
The question is, with auction wines that sell for $20,000 a case or a bottle, as the case may be, and they save it for 8 years and they open it up and it doesn't taste very good.
Yep. Well, if you're buying a wine at auction, you're buying it as is, and so you don't have much recourse. Although right now, how much recourse a buyer at auction would have is being tested in the courts, because there's one angry billionaire out there, Bill Koch, who feels that he's bought some bottles that were fakes, and those bottles cost him about $1 million or so. And so there's nothing worse than having an angry billionaire out there if you're a purveyor of the things that he was buying. And so he has actually brought a lot of suits in the fine wine world, and some of the litigation is still pending. But yeah, the most celebrated bottles that he bought were the so-called Jefferson, some of the so-called Jefferson bottles that were bottles that were attributed supposedly to the cellar of Thomas Jefferson. But yeah, Malcolm Forbes bought the first one, and he actually had it on display right here at the Forbes building in the lobby. And his son bought it returned from London auction where he bought it in the mid-'80s and propped it up under display lights in the lobby at the Forbes building. And sure enough, one day the security guard opens the building and there's the cork floating in the wine. And because they'd had it upright and under lights, and so the cork just dried out and fell in. So it was an expensive bottle of vinegar. It's $150,000.
Another question over here. What about cork,
Semi-real, yeah.
plastic versus real versus the real stuff, all right?
Yeah. Well, the cork industry would be a really fascinating Harvard Business School case study, I think, because they had complete dominance of their industry up until about the 1980s. Every wine bottle until then was closed, for a period of at least 100 or 200 years, was closed with a bit of tree bark. Cork is actually a piece of bark from a certain type of oak tree, the Quercus alba, principally from the Iberian Peninsula. And so they had a dominant market, and then all of a sudden consumers started to get these off aromas, and there was greater awareness of a problem. And it seemed to be coming because there was different bottles would be fine and other bottles would be bad. And so ultimately some research tracked it down to the cork itself that was a vector for this highly off-putting aroma it's carried in what's a volatile compound called TCA, or technically trichloroanisole 2,4,6 is what it's known as. Highly volatile. One of my friends had his daughter, she was doing her math homework, and he had her work out how much TCA it would take to make all of Lake Erie smell corked, and it was actually only one glass of TCA, pure TCA, would spoil all of Lake Erie. So it's really potent stuff. It's not harmful to you, but it has this off aromas of like moldy newspapers that have been trapped in a basement for weeks, sort of thing, and really smells bad. But when you smell a wine like that, that's not the way the winemaker intended, and you can send it back at a restaurant. So I know people really like sending wine back. So, so that was how corks kind of started to lose their market share. In New Zealand, the occurrence of TCA seemed particularly high, and so the New Zealanders really took to alternative closures, principally the screw cap. And so now it's hard to find a wine that comes out of New Zealand that's not under screw cap. But then there are other closures too, these synthetic corks, which are made of plastic, essentially. And the biggest purveyor now of these synthetic corks is a company that came from, it's actually founded by a Belgian guy who he made his fortune in what do you call it, pipe insulation. And then pipe insulation, if you can think about it, actually looks kind of like those noodles that you get in a swimming pool, and he makes those too. And then he made plastic corks with the same technology, basically. So yeah, that noodle from your swimming pool could also be in your wine bottle. So now there's a variety of corks. Corks have continued to lose market share. I think they're about, it's a little bit hard to tell, but it's about low 60 percentile of the market now. And those synthetic corks are the second highest, actually, and then screw caps. But you're... Yep, but then you don't have the TCA problem. The wine won't be corked. It won't be off the bottle.
Several of you do have more questions,
Yeah.
and we will be able
right.
to answer them
Yeah.
after the session is over here.
Okay,
So
all right.
now, I just want to give myself the final question here.
Okay, all right.
And it's a very simple question. What's the future?
The future, I think we're going to see more wines from more places. I think we're going to see wines from farther north. As global warming takes off, and there are a lot of plantings in some warm areas now. I think going forward it's going to be harder to produce wines from those warmer areas. I think we're going to see proliferation of packaging and closure types more and more in that regard. I think that more and more Americans are going to be wanting to raise a glass with dinner, and I think that's a really exciting story. So.
Let me ask just one final question. We have some students here, and many of them are actually interested in wine. So what would you recommend for those that are interested in wine? How would they go about a career in this, or is there a career here?
Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a career in wine. The wine industry is very diverse, and even in New York City, there's plenty of jobs at restaurants or shops, as well as sales jobs for distributors or PR companies and things. So you can have a job in the wine industry and not leave New York City even. But yeah, I would say maybe start at a shop on the weekends or something like that, and get to know wines and taste some wines, because they're always, if you go to a good shop, they're going to have bottles open and tastings and things like that. So it's a good way to start. But yeah, but as far as finding a good wine, I would say I have two recommendations for you. One, get a good glass, because if you just
What's a good glass?
Well, a crystal glass that's sort of a little bit more tapered at the top, a little bit wider, sort of is kind of. Yeah, and so that way it sort of concentrates the aromas a bit more. You can get a good glass. You don't have to break the bank. You can get a nice glass for $10 a stem, and so you can get two, one for you and your partner for $20. You could get six, have some people over, but it really makes all wines taste better. And I don't think you need to have a different glass for each grape variety from each region, and like install new cabinetry in your kitchen and things like that to accommodate all these glasses. Just two nice glasses, six nice glasses, something, when you have people over. I think that really helps elevate all wines. And so it's really very, very nice thing. And secondly, I would say, as far as finding good wines, it's hard for me to make a specific recommendation for people because I don't know where they live or what's available in their local stores and stuff. But I do think that finding a good local store is a great way to connect yourself with the stream of good wines. So if you can be friends with the clerk there, go in and say, I've got a budget of X dollars, or I want to try 6 wines in this style. Have the clerk give you some recommendations, and then cycle back to that store. Take your receipt. Keep your receipt in the kitchen. When you open the wine, say what you think about it. Give it a score. Do whatever you want to do. Check marks, stars, whatever your rating system is, and then maybe take the receipt back to the store if you can't remember, and show what you liked, and then maybe the clerk who's knowledgeable then can help you connect with some more fun wines. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Tyler.
Definitely.